the INDOT YouTube channel. I think we did that previously with the EWPO, the last EWPO meeting. So we will see if we can do that with this one for those that aren't able to join us. Brief housekeeping things. Please mute your line and turn off your camera to ensure optimal conditions. We will have quite a lot of people on here. Megan Hinkle and Kellen Alexander are going to be doing some minor technical support with trying to make certain everybody comes in, to make certain that they're muted and that everybody can actually get into the webinar workshop. If you have questions or technical issues, just use the chat. We will be using the chat to cover some of the different questions because I would like to make it a little interactive. We are not going to be using polls this time, but we do have some ideas for future presentations that we'll throw out at the end as well. There also will be a question aspect at the very end. You guys can go ahead when that happens. You can unmute to ask questions, but we please do ask that you raise your hand first, and then we'll call on you, just because there will be a lot of people participating today. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. I will shut my camera off just so that people, it cuts down a little bit on the bandwidth, and so that you don't have a little person talking to you in the corner. So hopefully everybody can everybody still hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah, it's saying I have bad network quality, which is interesting since I'm plugged directly into the state network. Okay. So today it is for this INDOT ESD workshop, it's Environmental Policy Office. It's October. I can't believe it's October yet, and I'm probably sure that's the same with everybody else. Today's agenda, we'll be talking about purpose and need, logical termini, independent utility, a quick step walkthrough. We added a few items since the last time that, or since we initially sent out the agenda. And so we will also be talking about commitment resolutions in Federal Highway Order 6640.1A, because that's always fun. So just be aware that we did expand the agenda a little bit. It's mostly because it's pertinent topics to what's going on and that we noticed. So before we continue on, if anybody's unaware of it, I'm Brandon Miller. I'm the NEPA team lead with the INDOT Environmental Services Division, Environmental Policy Office. And so we'll just be going through some of the different topics that were in the agenda, and hopefully it will be informative, and hopefully it will make for better documents submitted, which hopefully means less comments that come back from either us at central office or the district reviewers. And that way we can keep moving along with each project in a timely and orderly fashion. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is purpose and need. And this slide is just mostly pointing out the different resources that are available. The first one is Federal Highways NEPA guidance on purpose and need. That link should work. If not, if it doesn't, you can always do a quick, simple Google search of Federal Highway purpose and need, and generally it will get to that. One of the key takeaways that I want to point out for that is are these 3 bullet points that I pulled directly from it. And pretty much any NEPA document that you work with should be identifying or making certain that the purpose and need meets these 3 things. So justification of why the improvement must be implemented, that you're as comprehensive and as specific as possible, and that it's re-examined and updated as appropriate throughout the project development process. And that's I point that out because sometimes we get comments saying, well, I pulled the purpose and need from an engineering report. Why do I need to update it now? Well, they're not necessarily considering it in the NEPA framework, and sometimes you have to make it so it's more understandable for the layperson and the public. So it can get refined. You can even change your purpose and need as late as after public involvement for a project. However, if you do, there are things that you have to do in terms of that, such as going back and reevaluating every single decision that you've made up to that point to see if it's still, if the decision-making process is still valid for each of the different steps that you've taken. So one example that I can provide that came to mind when I was putting the presentation together for something of this nature would be a linear project. Let's say it's roughly 2 miles in length. Most of it's HMA overlay, just road rehab. But at one end of the project in the engineer report, it talks about wanting to reduce left-hand turn weights. How long an individual waits at a left-hand turn. And so as the NEPA preparer, you may be going through and going, okay, well, and asking the engineer and the project sponsor, well, what is a clear goal that you're wanting to meet? Maybe it's listed in the engineering report, maybe it's not. And so you insert reducing left-hand turn weights. Let's say you want to get it from above 30 seconds to below 30 seconds. And so you put into your purpose and need that one of your goals is to reduce left-hand wait times. Well, if you have it that generic at the beginning, if you go on further into the public development stage and maybe you have over half an acre of right-of-way and you get to public involvement and somebody brings up a different location that was not covered in the engineering report as being identified as an area where there's long wait times. And so you have to reevaluate because now you've been told that there's more locations that you need to adjust for. Maybe your intention is to go and only fix that one. Well, if you're going to have to adjust your purpose and need, you have to go back through and evaluate all of the decisions that you made up to that decision to see if you would change anything else, and to refine your purpose and need even further. And then the other aspect that you have to that you would have to do is you would likely have to go back out to the public and explain the change that you made to the purpose and need so that everybody is aware of what the intentions are. That could lead into other issues, but you can do it all the way up until NEPA approval. Once you finish with NEPA approval, that's when you have your finalized defined purpose and need. As Dave Dye pointed out in the chat, the purpose and need should not change post NEPA approval prior to an AI. And that's true. You can change it in an AI, but if you change it in an AI, the issue that you run into is that you have to go back through and reevaluate all the decisions you made in the NEPA document and project development up to that AI. So just be aware of that. Sometimes it's easier if you have additional things that you determine are needed to have a separate project. So moving away from the federal highway guidance, the other thing I wanted to point out is that in chapter 4.2.2, we have a fairly long explanation of, in our CE manual, which is the second link, of purpose and need and the different things that we're looking for in the purpose and need. Tamara will get into that question in the future. We may not. It depends on availability of individuals and what the current climate is for in-person. And virtual. So we can look into that, but likely I don't know what the plan is for the future. So back to the CE manual, we have a lot of information. We've tried to update it in the most recent iteration for 2021. We tried to put in different examples of things that you may be using for helping to provide the justification so that you can make it comprehensive and as specific as possible. It doesn't mean that it covers everything. It does mean that it does try to give a better framework than was in the previous version. And then the final, or one of the other things I wanted to point out, and it's nice and red and bold right here, the CE manual, we spent a lot of time updating it, trying to make it more modern and more consistent from one section to the other section. If you get a comment in regards to a specific section, it's likely because it's in the CE manual, and so we always recommend read the CE manual, be aware of what's in there, read other guidance that we've put out. We don't do it just for us, it's so that we can try and make a consistent approach, because that's what NEPA is. It's a process. It's not necessarily completely the end solution. It's a generalized process, and that's how we come to the decisions. And that beyond the CE manual, there's the SAM manual, there's the CRM, those and the EPO manuals. Those manuals and guidance documents are updated frequently. We try to make certain that we send out listservs, and we know that we will be doing an update to some parts of the CE manual in the near future, just from what everybody has used it so far. But just be aware of that. It's very useful to go and read all of our documentation. And the final thing I wanted to point out was this CFR, 23 CFR 771.11 F3. And just be aware, one of the biggest things that we think about when we are reviewing documents is that the purpose and need does not unnecessarily restrict the consideration of alternatives for other reasonably foreseeable transportation improvements. It's a very, very important thing. You cannot just have a solution in the purpose and need. It's something that we've mentioned for at least 13 years. And Ron probably can point out before that, and anybody else that's been doing it for a longer period of time. But at least since 2008, when I started with INDOT, we have been preaching that the purpose, or in the purpose and need, you should not be having a specific alternative, because that would limit the consideration of all other reasonable alternatives. All right.
Hey, Brandon, this is Megan.
Yep.
I'm sorry if people can see a pop-up box on your presentation. We're having some trouble admitting a guest into the lobby. So Gabriel Franco, if you can hear us, if you can close out of Teams and then try logging back in, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So purpose and need, in very, very narrow terms, when we talk about purpose and need, usually we want you to talk about need first. It identifies the problem, the deficiency, the missing facilities that might be present or not present, and then talk about the purpose. And the purpose should be a measurable goal. Sometimes that measurable goal can be a yes or no. If you do yes or no, that's going to make it so you have potentially a lot of alternatives that you can consider. So just be aware of that. And then the other thing is be succinct. If you do not have to throw the kitchen table at the purpose and need. Sometimes based off of the purpose and need, other action or other items will be necessary for a project. So just be aware of that, such as an added travel lane project for 14 miles or so. If you are doing that, you probably have bridges that you have to replace to make it so that you can actually have an added travel lane project for that 14 miles. In that case, you do not necessarily have to specifically call out what's the issues with the bridges. So we're going to go through a few examples, and feel free to chime in the chat as to what your thoughts are. So the first example that we have is INDOT, with funding from the Federal Highway Administration, are proposing to build a mitigation site, and I didn't go any further than that. Can anyone specify what's the major thing that's wrong with just that statement?
States the solution.
Correct. It states the solution. So one of the things that comes up frequently is that there are mitigation sites that are needed. And so it comes into a discussion as to whether or not you actually need to have an individual purpose and need for the mitigation site. It's very infrequent that you have a standalone mitigation site. It can happen, but it's very rare. Usually the mitigation sites are usually tied to a project. If it's tied to a project, then you should not have a new purpose and need. The purpose and need would be what was in the original project where you're doing this mitigation site for. And so you're pointing back towards the original document, and in that case, you would have an additional information document, which means that you don't have a new purpose and need. This is just detailing additional impacts as a result of that previous project. Even if it ends up being that it's off-site from the initial location, you would be pointing back towards that site. That's a little bit different than what we've said in the past in regards to having a standalone CE. The way that we've developed the CEEA form is so that you can more easily use it for AI documents, such as for mitigation sites that may be off-site. It has all the different categories. You would go through and you'd be talking to different resource agencies about the site, but you would not necessarily have a standalone CE document for a mitigation site. So just be aware of that. So in this case, the best way to actually deal with the purpose and need is to actually punt it back to the original document and just say that the original purpose and need has not changed. We did have one question from Michelle. For bundled projects, is it okay to discuss purpose and need for each project separately, especially if they're vastly different? If the projects are vastly different, you likely have multiple different environmental documents. You should generally talk with the project sponsor to see how many environmental documents they were expecting. And if it's, for example, the state, because the state is the one that does most of the bundling, specifically talk with the, if you're a sub, talk with your prime. If you're the prime, talk with the environmental group in the district. Start with the district first, and talk with the INDOT PM. They may not necessarily notice that it's different for each one. So I know that's kind of a runaround to your question, Rochelle, but hopefully it helps a little bit. Because if you end up having multiple different projects in a bundle, you probably have, it may be better to just do individual documents, individual PCEs or CE1s for the different groups. Okay, our second example can be seen on the screen. I'm not going to read it to everybody unless somebody wants me to. But based off of what is shown, what do people think is good? What do people think is bad? There are some good things to quite a few of these purpose and needs, except for that first one. That's a good one, Dave. So Dave said that the purpose of going with a condition rating of 9 out of 9 limits what you can actually do. So it pretty well almost eliminates rehab. The other thing to point out about the purpose is that it just says the condition rating. It doesn't specify which condition rating. So in this case, the condition would be for the superstructure, which is the one that's rated poor. And so you want to make certain that you are making certain that you allow for rehab or replacement to happen. And improve is a good point, Dave, because the improving this bridge. So one way that you can improve it is to say that the purpose is to have a bridge structure with a condition rating of at least 7, which is good out of 9. That allows for having an improvement to the structure and mentioning the superstructure specifically, I don't think I did mention that. But 7 is an achievable goal for a rehab. 9 is usually not something that can be achieved because there's other factors that may influence it. So not having a 9 out of 9 is a big part. Yep, and Dave points out asking for provide for something, and that works quite a bit. Another thing is in the need. The big thing about the need is that it throws the kitchen sink at it. The big issue is with the superstructure. It's not with all the other aspects. The other aspects can just be discussed in the project description. It does not have to. You don't actually have to get into all that detail of the other aspects because it's not the driving factor for the project. And one thing I wanted to point out with this is that with whatever option that you choose for the project description or for the preferred alternative, you may be still impacting one of those other parts of the bridge. So if you replace the superstructure, it's more than likely they're going to be replacing the deck and wearing surfaces. But that's an additional impact because of what the preferred solution is. It's not a driving factor as to what the project is. Okay. The next one deals with pedestrian facilities. Okay, can anybody point out different things that are potentially wrong with this purpose and need? And be aware that these are purpose and needs that we've pulled from initial submittals. So we may have altered some things and cut it down for just length, so that you don't have to read long paragraphs for the training or for this workshop. So April mentions there should only mention the others. Yep, that was for the, it all depends on if it's a goal. So let me take a quick step back for April. So one big thing is that, and we point this out frequently on historic bridge alternative analyses when we go through it. We like to see that whatever's listed in the need matches up with a goal and the purpose. So you may have more than just one item for the purpose, but if it's talked about in the need, it's talked about in the purpose. Michael mentions that this purpose and need is too general. It talks about different areas. It's hard to measure. There's a typo, which happens late at night when you're typing things. Sarah Everhart and Karen both point out what's unsafe. How exactly are you defining that? The purpose includes connectivity, which is not in the need. And Colin points that out pretty well. Yeah, so that's a pretty good overview of the different issues that are wrong, or that are a problem with this purpose and need. Sometimes you'll be given a pedestrian, an area where there's deficiencies, whether it's like a city block, or whether it's a trail that goes from one location to another. When you're working with that, sometimes the purpose and need isn't as clear. And so one thing to consider when you're working with your purpose and need is to specifically point out the different things that you're trying to connect. So if you're trying to connect a residential neighborhood to a school, or trying to connect or worry about the downtown area, because it's frequently used by a lot of pedestrians, but just being specific about those different areas. Narrow it down. A city is a large area. There's likely not a lot that you can actually do for an entire city. I'm not opposed to it. It's just that it's a funding issue. So Brock, let me jump to the chat for a second. I'll talk about safety in a second. Let me jump to Brock. Brock mentions in the previous example, doesn't limiting the discussion of rating limits what solutions are being considered. For example, a good rating on substructure demonstrates that the superstructure replacement is sufficient, but if both are poor, then solutions may include work on both or either. The additional ratings help guide the solution and limit it. It does. In the previous example, however, the superstructure was poor, but the wearing surface and the substructure were both good. So it didn't make too much sense as to include those in the need or in the purpose. The biggest thing that needed work on was the superstructure. So if you just, it doesn't take away that replacement of the superstructure is fine. Maybe replacing the entire bridge ends up being more economically feasible with generally less impacts because of however the bridge was designed. We just don't need to go into a lot of the detail, and if we can keep it succinct, it's very useful. Okay, Karen and Bridget kind of, and also Nikayla mentioned safety. So one of the biggest things that people frequently bring up is trying to improve safety on a roadway. One of the biggest things, if you've not noticed or if you've not submitted comments before, is that when that is brought up, we have been asking quite a bit for supporting data on that. A lot of these examples don't have the supporting data included. It's not because it's not important, it's because I'm trying to keep things a little bit short and to the point. But when you're talking about safety, every action frequently has a different reaction or a different aspect that may change safety. So for example, if you have a bridge that does not have a rail and you decide to put a rail into it, you may be improving safety because you're preventing vehicles from going off the bridge. However, you are also putting something into the way for vehicles to hit, and maybe they hit it more frequently than they would have if they had gone off if they had gone off a bridge. Similar thing, like if you, I mean, not everything has to necessarily be improving safety. Usually there's a different thing. If you are quoting safety, be sure to include supporting documentation. Don't just assume because it sounds like a good word to include that you're actually improving safety. There may not be a safety issue. It may be a design issue. It may be a long-term functionality issue. So for example, with a superstructure that has a poor rating, it may be perfectly safe for 15 more years without any additional work. The railing may be perfectly fine. But it is not necessarily a safety issue. When it comes to pedestrian facilities, it's not always safety that's the driving factor. Maybe it's that there's actually no ADA curb ramps in a community. That's an accessibility issue. It's not necessarily a safety issue that could be driving your project. So if you're talking safety, make certain that you are supporting it with documentation. So that would be police reports of incidences or traffic accidents, an analysis for traffic saying that there's been X number of accidents that have been this type and that correlates with this issue. So just be aware that if you are talking safety, that you need to provide supporting documentation. You can cite generally what the issue is or what the safety issue is and the need, and then include the supporting documentation as an appendix. It doesn't have to be every single police report for an intersection for the past 15 years. It can be just a simple report that has been reviewed by the design team or a traffic engineer that shows that this is, and you can just include the narrative in the appendix. Supporting data is important when it comes to risk and any associated court decisions that or court cases that may come from a project, from one person suing it over something. If you're overly generous, then they may take it to be that that something should have been done. If you're more specific, then at least it comes down to what the issue is that you were trying to solve. It doesn't mean that it's unfortunate that something happened for a project that's been updated, but it doesn't, I mean, the whole point is to narrow down the focus. And the final purpose and need part that we'll talk about is secondary purposes or other desirable goals. If any of you have taken the purpose and need training or not the purpose and need training, if you've taken the NEPA training in the past 13 years, you've seen this chart. One thing that I wanted to point out on this chart is that when we go through it in the NEPA and CE training is that the primary purpose is the driving factor. The other desirable outcomes is, as it says, it's an other desirable outcome or goal. It doesn't have to happen. So for example, if you're trying to do a quick evaluation of alternatives, the two that meet the primary purpose are alternative 2 and 3. Neither of them meet the other desirable goal. This one does meet this one, but depending on the impacts or what the cost is, you may be selecting alternative 3. Not all projects will ever need a secondary purpose. They're more frequent on larger, more impactful projects, such as an EA or an EIS. It's not very frequent that it happens with a CE level document. Mostly because if you're going through and you have an other desirable goal, are you evaluating any other alternative that does not meet that other desirable goal? Because if you're not looking at something that doesn't do it, then it, in all essence, is acting as a primary purpose and not something that you want secondary. And you're being somewhat disingenuous with the public in saying that it's, oh, we would like it to happen, but if it doesn't, we're fine with it. Well, if you don't look at alternatives that don't cover the other desire with not meeting that other desirable, are you actually doing it? So infrequently for CEs that happens. So just be aware that if you're wanting to include it, just be aware that you should be looking at alternatives that do not actually meet that, or else you actually just have a primary purpose that you want to not necessarily point out as a driving factor for it. And then the other thing is, if it's another desirable outcome and all of your alternatives are meeting it and it's not a driving factor, it's just something that's happening, it may not even need to be listed as an other desirable outcome at all for the project. So just be aware of that when it comes to secondary purposes. They are extremely infrequent with CE level documents. And we had that discussion about a CE level document, a more complex one where it may not necessarily have to be done because it just may not, I mean, it's not necessarily a driving factor for the project. Brock had one question before we move on to logical termini. In the need, is the measurable all that is needed, which is pretty general, or should it also include a discussion of what the measurable will actually do? For example, perpetuate the crossing of the river or prevent erosion of the bank and protect the bridge footing / abutments. So one thing that I want to point out is sometimes there's quote unquote fluff language added in into the purpose. So the best example of where it happens frequently deals with the purpose and need for bridges or culverts, any sort of general crossing of water. Frequently, somebody will put in that they want to make certain that it's hydrologically adequate and perpetuates transportation across the stream. Unless you've identified a hydrological issue with the culvert or bridge, it's not necessary to repeat or to indicate that it is. You are generally going to be selecting an alternative that's hydrologically adequate. Or else you're going to be dismissing it because it's going to flood the roadway and it's not a reasonable alternative. In terms of perpetuating traffic over a structure, unless the structure is closed, likely you do not need to mention that you need to continue to perpetuate traffic over it. It's assumed that since it's a transportation project, you want transportation to go over it. If it's closed, that changes it, and that can be one of the goals, and that ends up being a yes or a no. So doing something to be able to allow for traffic to go over some closed structure can be part of the purpose. But in general, I like to keep it a little bit more narrowed and focused down. Does that mean that I'm going to add comments to take it out? The answer is no. Not unless I have to make some sort of comment in regards to other parts of it, in which case then I may just cross out big portions of it and just make it more succinct. Okay, the next topic, and I need to pick it up, is logical termini. Similar thing to purpose and need. If you type it in, you have into Google, you can always find this link as well, where you just type in project termini, federal highway, and you should be able to get it as one of the first few things or search results. The two things that I want to point out in that guidance is rational endpoints for transportation improvement and rational endpoints for a review of the environmental impacts. So it does cover both aspects of it. It's not just what the improvement is, but it also gives you rational endpoints for a review of the environmental impacts. Frequently, we go a little bit wider than just the impacts to see what else is out there. But in terms of describing the environmental impacts, it's about what is in the area. So the other thing on this list is 23 CFR 771.111F1. And this is where it's codified and discussed about connect logical termini and be of sufficient length to address environmental matters on a broad scope. So just be aware that there is a CFR that covers logical termini. One thing I do want to point out, and this is something that happens more so even with INDOT projects, your termini should not be defined specifically based off of artificial lines. And that's a weird way of saying don't randomly end your project at a farm field that's on the outskirts of town where it ends in a farm field. So if a city or county limits, and you're saying you're trying to keep everything within it, if it ends in a location that does not make sense, does not have if you end it in a farm field, it's not a logical termini. So avoid trying to just use county limits, city limits, district limits as to the reason or why you're ending a project where you're ending it. It should be based off of what the actual improvement is that you're trying to do. That also does include avoiding resources. for not wanting to do it. Be aware that CEQ regulations do discuss if something is reasonably foreseeable to be done, and if so, it should be included in the NEPA document. So for example, if you talk about connecting between a hospital and a park and you end up stopping short of the park as your termini, then you should evaluate in the NEPA document for finishing out that that logical portion that's reasonably foreseeable. What about the need for roadway conditions? So Sarah, that is a fun one. Talk about, so when you're dealing with that, you do not want to get into a situation where you continue on, continue on, and continue on. Sometimes it's outside the jurisdiction, and you can explain maybe because of that change in jurisdiction, the roadway character changes. So you want to talk about doing that. Maybe it changes beforehand because maybe the county overlapped a little bit into the city limits because the city limits didn't extend out to that location. So look at what the situation is and evaluate it based off of that. Be aware that if you identify issues and you're trying to cover like pedestrian access or pedestrian facilities and roadway stuff, maybe you're stopping the roadway or you're stopping the pedestrian stuff before you stop the roadway. Doesn't make sense that you're stopping it. Should you continue on? Should you have two southern termini? It seems awkward to say that you have two southern termini. So look at the situation. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes there is a quality difference in the roadway that's outside of a city limit versus what's inside the city limit. So just try and find the different portions. I only have two examples for logical termini. These are the previous purpose and needs that we did. I did not improve them. They are the exact same ones. I bring this in because purpose and need and logical termini, they coincide with one another. How well you define a project in your purpose and need can really do a lot to help you define where your actual logical termini actually is located. So this is repurpose purpose and need. In this case, the logical termini for the project is 100 feet on either side of the center of the bridge. And then I have two questions for you. And Sarah, in response to your question, that sounds like it probably is a project-specific situation. And I'm fairly well certain of the potential project that you're talking about. So if you want to set up a meeting, you can always send a doodle poll to us or some other polling thing for time. And Brock points out the biggest thing. It's not logical. They're just project termini. So when you're defining logical termini, on the surface, it seems to make sense. However, how long is the bridge? Maybe the bridge is 250 feet long. If you're only going 100 feet from the center of the bridge, you may not be covering the entire aspect of the bridge. It doesn't cover the incidental construction that may need to be done with approaches to tie it in. And then the other point is something that Lisa points out, which is you need a reference point for each end of the logical termini. And that's true. don't base it off of the thing that you're trying to fix. Base it off of something that is nearby, especially when it comes to bridges or culverts. Frequently, if you look into the STIP or TIP information, it will actually point out to where exactly the project is located, or maybe the engineering report will point out where it's located. You should base it off of that. It should be based off of the location of intersections. So be aware of how exactly you define it. And as Lisa points out and Brock points out, be sure that you're covering the incidental stuff to make certain that it's a functional thing. Because maybe a replacement of the superstructure causes it so that the roadway is 1.5 inches, or that the bridge is 1.5 inches above the roadway. Well, you need to make certain that you have the approaches as well.
Ron, could you please explain again what you meant by identifying a point for each of the termini?
Yeah, so let's say that you are 1/2 mile away from the intersection of Miller Boulevard and Miller Street. Do your distance for each of the termini based off of that from the distance of that intersection. So maybe it's 0.48 miles west of the intersection of those two roadways to 0.52 miles west of that intersection. That way you're covering so that people can easily identify where the termini are in the grand scheme of the world. But they also you can also look and see it if you were to try and measure it out yourself.
So in this question, was the center of the bridge not an appropriate reference point to identify those?
Yeah, the center of the bridge, because it's very possible with when you're dealing with it, you have two questions. Are you talking about the existing bridge, or are you talking about the future structure? If you're talking about the future structure, you don't necessarily know what it is in your purpose, and it's hard to be going towards that. If you're basing off the existing, you really want to make certain that you're pointing out where the project is in terms of the real world. If you just say the center of the bridge, there are a lot of bridges in Indiana. How do I know I'm at the right one that you're talking about? Brian asked, can you use Milepost? Yes and no. They can be supplemental, but be sure to make certain that you are, when you're using any sort of reference posting, that it's something that's easily understood by the general public. So if you use 48 plus 010, the public may not understand what that means. April talks about April's getting a little ahead of us in regards to some of the logical termini discussion. Yeah. So we'll get into that because there's the third part of the 3 items that we're covering today. So let's go through this next one really quick. And I want to point this one out. I know that we'll get back to some of the other parts. And Jenna, that is a very good way of describing it. If somebody were to try and get onto Google Maps or Google Earth or Yahoo Maps or Bing Maps, if you're whatever flavor of search engine you prefer, you want to make it so it's easily identifiable for the public. These are public documents. And so for the public to be able to easily identify it, you want to make certain that it's written in a manner that they can actually understand. And April, we'll get back to your question on the next part, which is independent utility. So logical termini. In this case, it's the same one before about pedestrian facilities. And apparently the termini, it's a new multi-use trail from Miller Park to an existing trail outside of Miller Estates, approximately 0.4 miles west of the intersection of Miller Boulevard and Miller Street. I'm not trying to say my name a lot of times, but I am. Does this seem logical? So one of the termini does sound generally logical, which is the one that's the existing trail outside of Miller Estates, and you give a reference as to where exactly that's located. The other one, the multi-use trail, or the Miller Park, that's extremely vague. Parks can be quite large. Where exactly does it need to connect to? Does it need to connect to an entrance? Does it need to connect to an existing trail that apparently goes off to a different location? Trying to find where exactly what the terminus is with Miller Park. The other point I want to point out is sometimes the termini discussion that's here will be what's given to you as to, hey, this is what we're working towards doing. And that can help you identify for your purpose and need what exactly it is that you're trying to do. So in this case, if you're doing a multi-use trail from Miller Park to Miller Estates, you'd want to be sure to identify in the need what's lacking between those two different locations. Is it just that there's not a direct route to it and everybody has to go half a mile out of the way to be able to go and do that? And for people that don't frequently walk, half a mile is quite a long way to actually have to go. Even a mile is a decently long distance because you're talking 10 to 20 minutes if you're walking at a fast pace. So sometimes the termini that are given to you can help you better define the purpose and need so that you can get more specific. So the third part that I really wanted to point out is independent utility. In 23 CFR 771.11 F2, all NEPA documents should have independent utility or independent significance, i.e. be usable and be a reasonable expenditure, even if no additional transportation improvements in the area are made. So one thing I really want to point out is, if anybody has noticed, is that I've talked completely in these three different things, about 23 CFR 771.11 F. F1 was logical termini, F2 is independent utility shown here, F3 is reasonable range of alternatives, which is your purpose and need. Even in the Code of Federal Regulations, it's all tied together. So when you're talking about independent utility, you want to make certain that you can finish the project that you identify that you're going to be doing. So that gets back into the discussion about logical termini. Sometimes you may have to include a little bit of description in the termini to show exactly why it is sufficient for the project, which then ties into the independent utility. So for example, with this bridge covering as April asked about, do we need to talk about why these are logical? Yeah, and so what you can do is you can say, hey, our termini is from this to this. This allows us to work on the approaches and get the preferred alternative so that it ties back into the existing roadway network. There you go. You have a pretty good logical termini. You explain why exactly you're doing it. And if you talk about how it intertwines or how that is logical, all of a sudden you've also explained why your project is independent. If we tie back into the existing roadway network, there's not anything else that we need to do with this project. It has independent utility. There's no additional projects that are needed. Brock asked, are you saying that the project termini provided should be self-explanatory for why the termini are logical, or is it sufficient to just be able to explain why they are logical? Sometimes it's helpful to provide a sentence or two. As I just explained, giving a couple sentences saying that, hey, these termini include approach work so that it can tie the new updated structure or new structure altogether back into the existing roadway network. That pretty well covers why your project's logical. So sometimes it is self-evident. So like for this trail, if the purpose indicated about improving or shortening the connections or making it more direct route for between Miller Park and Miller Estates, your termini can be unto itself logical if you are saying, hey, we're doing it to this location just outside of Miller Estates so people can access that, and it goes all the way down to Miller Park. April asked, do we need to include lateral work, if any, as well as linear work? Bank stabilization, so many feet from the bridge up and downstream. You can always, so there's always going to be terminus that go up and down as well. Frequently, we don't discuss that too much unless you're actually getting into a discussion about having to change a channel or do something else, or it's an intersection improvement where you're trying where you're doing work on a north-south and east-west location. If you're just doing a bridge, you can talk about in the project description approximately how far off the edge of pavement the work is going to be done. That's generally self-explanatory. In those cases, we're focusing mostly on the linear aspect, but sometimes you may have to provide an explanation on the other all four directions, depending on what the project entails. Okay, one thing that came up and I wanted to do a quick brief overview of is a STIP walkthrough. Here's the website. I'll be honest, and some people may find this funny, but I actually do not have it bookmarked. So I look it up every single time because the state of Indiana sometimes decides to change what the addresses are. So I just wanted to point out a few different things for people, especially when it comes to the project listing. When it comes to INDOT reviews, and when I point this out, hopefully you guys will be aware of it so that when you submit some things, that you can make your life easier and our life easier. And that deals with the STIP pages. So if you look, here's the fiscal year 2020 to 2024. It's the current STIP. When it comes to where we go to find our projects, it's just down here. One thing I want to point out first is the date at the bottom down here when the report is created. Whenever you guys include your STIP pages, we do look at what it is, and we will pull up the STIP pages here to see what the most recent one is. We don't get as many updates. We don't get the updates, just like you probably don't get the updates as to when there's an update, a new amendment, or a new modification to the STIP. I get enough emails that it's easy enough for me to just do a quick check to see when the report was created. And that's something that you guys should do as well. Frequently, individuals will stick in a STIP at the very beginning of the project, and that can be a good placeholder for it. But also double check for certain before you actually submit it, what STIP pages did I include? Because there's possibility that there's been different updates that have happened with it. And so when I pull up the page, I'll look to see when the report was created. I'll look to see when your project was created as well, or when your page was pulled out, because it will be hopefully the same page, or it will be something similar. So when it comes down to how exactly I find things, I just do a quick search and it will pop up and it will highlight what it is. So in this case, I just pulled up this auxiliary passing lane project. It came up twice, once here, once here. And it tells you a lot of different things. First off, it tells you who the sponsor is. So just be aware of these different columns. They do mean quite a bit and can be extremely helpful. So it says who the project sponsor is. It will give you a contract number, which is the first number here. It will give you a DES number, which is how I searched for it. Sometimes you may be working off of a bundled contract and you need to find where exactly it is, and you may not know the lead DES number, and so you can find stuff based off of the contract. The next thing is the STIP name, and I pulled this one up because it has two very important things. So it has two entries. The first one says INIT, which means that it was part of the initial STIP. The other one, it says A001. Well, what does that mean? It means that it was an amendment. And I'll show you quickly how to find the amendment if you want to find it. It will tell you what the route is. In terms of if it's, let's step back a second. In terms of the STIP name, if it says M, that means it's a modification. In this case, we just have an amendment. It tells you a general work type. Hopefully this work type matches up with what you guys are doing, because that is one of the criteria for ensuring that the project is conforming to the Clean Air Act and amendments, is that the work type matches up. And same thing with the Termini. If you are generally, if it ends up being that you're doing, in this case, it's about a 1.5 to 2 mile project roughly. If you're doing a project and it's 15 miles long, but it's only showing that it's good for 1.5 miles, that's an issue. You're not fully evaluating conformity for it. It tells you what the district is, miles. I'm not going to get into federal category. Frequently, it'll say the different ones. You can type in the categories into Google or your favorite search engine and figure out what the different things mean. I'm not going to get into that. It will hopefully tell you what the total cost of the project is. which can be extremely helpful for filling out a CE1. And then it gets into the different programs. And so in terms of this, there's mobility construction, road construction, and road consulting. There's various different other categories. The phases are important. So in this case, it's just PE, right-of-way, construction, which is part of the reason why I chose this one. It tells you how much you're spending federally for each different portion. But then it also tells you what the local or state match is as well. And then when you come into these fiscal years at the end, it tells you what fiscal year it's associated with. So here's the 196,775 for it, which hopefully when you add these two numbers together, you get this value. When you add these two numbers together, you get this. This is for fiscal year 22. And then up here for construction, you have a little bit of funding in 22 and a lot of funding in 23 to be able to do the project. So just be aware that you can get quite a bit of information from it. If you are curious as to what you can find out about these other aspects. Oh, before I move on. Currently, since we have the 2020 to 2024 step, that's a 5-year period. The 5th year is for informational purposes only. So if you have your next quote unquote phase, so construction or right of way, depending on which one's the next funded one, and it's only showing up in 2024, you can't get a NEPA approval. You'll likely have to wait until the next one goes through. So in terms of these amendments and modifications, let's step back one step. So if you come, and I'm assuming that they will keep it similar to what it is here for when the fiscal year 22 to 26 comes up, that they'll update it similarly, and then this will move down to historical STIP documents. So if you click on the individual amendments and modifications, you can actually come in here and look to see what they are. So if you recall, we had amendment 1 or 01. The way that the amendments work is you have amendment, the first year of the last two digits of the first year. So in this case, it's 2020 to 2024. So you get 20. And then you have 01, which is the first one. So hopefully when we come into here, you should be able to search for it and see, yeah, this is where it's at. And I just flip back to the next page. So you can find your STIP amendments. Here's all the amendments that are approved. Here's the approved modifications. Some of them are, if you're looking for other information, you might be able to find it in these other parts. I'm not going to get into the weeds of that, but we wanted to do a quick STIP walkthrough. That way you can actually make certain that I'll get to your question in a second, Susan. So going back to the presentation, double check your STIP and TIP prior to upload, because we will be checking it. We don't like to send things back because of it. Even if you go to public involvement and you resubmit it, do a quick check of the TIP STIP. Sometimes it will be updated with more information because of funding concerns. The other thing is make sure your costs are accurate. If not, add a note to the NEPA document about the INDOT PM working to make certain that the costs are accurate in the STIP prior to RFC, and make certain that the description matches. If your project description in the STIP says that it's a rehab and you're doing a replacement, you have a potential major issue. Susan asked, how do you identify the construction cost, right-of-way cost for a project that is included with a lead DES number? So you're talking bundled. In terms of bundled, list the bundled costs. You might be able to get from your prime or the designer what the specific cost is for that. You can describe that in the project description, but list the amounts that are under the bundled project. And just describe that it's bundled with that project. Lisa asked, I'm not clear on what you said regarding the multiple fiscal year costs. You cannot complete the environmental document in the first fiscal year. So in terms of the fiscal year, so NEPA approval can only be done if it's fiscally constrained. A STIP is a STIP in the TIP is for 4-year period. A 5th year can be included in a TIP and STIP. However, that 5th year is an informative year. It is not something that is fiscally constrained. So if you have a project in, let's say, it's listed in the 2020 to 2024 STIP, but the next phase that you have funding for, because you don't need right-of-way, is construction. If it's listed for fiscal year 24 for construction, you cannot get a NEPA approval until it's actually in a fiscally constrained STIP and TIP for that year. Brock asks if costs drop off the STIP because of the year spent is past, should we chase that cost in order to provide that cost? It should be listed it should be listed with the total cost if it's a CE1. If it's a previous year, look up to see how much was spent on it and put the fiscal year. You do not have to include the STIP pages for that old STIP and TIP. So if it's a 2019 expenditure, you don't have to include the 2018 to 2022 STIP pages in the document. Quick thing on commitment resolutions. This is more of an ECF thing, but we wanted to point it out because there are either PMs or designers or even environmental personnel may be asked to assist in trying to do some of this. We wanted to make certain that we pointed it out because it seems to be consistent things that come up to us. There is commitments guidance that we have on the EPO website, which is listed here. If you just type in INDOT EPO, you'll get to the INDOT Environmental Policy Office website. In that commitments guidance, which we will be updating later this year, we give whether or not they should be included in the NEPA document, or if commitments should be included in the NEPA document, or if they should be included, and if they should be included in the commitments database. That covers most of the frequent ones. Sometimes it's not frequent. So just be aware of that. And we will be trying to put some additional commitment resolution information in the ECF instructions as well. So everybody can read this, but just so that you are aware of it, we want things written down and provided to contractors. That way there's legal, we don't get into that legal he said, he said, or she said, he said, or she said, she said, or whatever situation it might be. So for it to be in the CIB. So In terms of USPs and plans, those are the most likely resolutions that you'll have. You can't just say that the all commitments report will be handed to somebody at the pre-con meeting. That doesn't work. The all commitments report unto itself is not part of the CIB. So just be aware of those different aspects. Most of the resolutions will either be taken in design, or they will be done, or it's something that will be passed on for the contractor to be aware of when they're doing it. So when you're dealing with a design oriented commitment, be sure that you explain kind of who, what, where, when, why, how. I mean, it's you can use the initial framework of the commitment to help start writing a resolution, but you need to be certain of explaining who, what, where, when, why, and how in those commitments. Sometimes they can be short, such as who is doing it? Well, the contractor is made aware of it in the CIP because it's in this USP resolution. So just be aware of that. And the other way of thinking about it is if we have a conversation because of some sort of audit, which do happen, 5 years down the road, can you actually remember how to do it? And some of those minor design choices you may not necessarily remember. So just be aware of that. I will see if I can answer the questions in here. Will frequently used USPs be converted to RSPs? Maybe. It depends on the fluidity of those USPs. It might be. Some of those RSPs may eventually also go away. So just be aware of that because sometimes they do become not useful anymore. Rich asked, could you provide an example of when attention to construction should or should not be used? Should a commitment resolved by USP automatically use attention to construction? Yes. If you are using a USP to resolve a commitment, it likely should mention that it's attention to construction. So that's where it comes into, and we tried to, in the commitments guidance that's existing right now, define what likely is done in design, what is done in design and in construction, or what is just construction. So just be aware that we do have that commitments guidance that does spell that out. One that should not be used for attention to construction is replacement of trees. That's a frequent one that you're trying to determine in design. You don't want construction to go out there and plant trees randomly because you never know where exactly you're going to get them or if you'll even get them. That's something that should be covered in design. Can the project accommodate tree planting at the location? If not, explain why not. If you can, try to include tree plantings as part of the project. In terms of and that one would be resolved if it's attention to if you can do it, you can mark it as attention to construction, and your resolution would likely be pointing out the plan sheets that say, hey, there's tree. This is where we're able to do tree plantings. And Dave does point out a big thing. The change in scope right away is one of the design-centric commitments and should be resolved from the designer's perspective. Don't just repeat the commitment. And that is very important. Don't just repeat the commitment. Rochelle asked, why is the cost of the project included in the NEPA document? It's to allow people to be aware that there are costs associated with everything that's done. That's one thing. You're spending taxpayer money, they should be able to know where exactly the money is going towards. That's the simplest answer, is that the public just deserves to know. And we have 5 minutes left, but I do want to point out one final thing. Permissible project-related activities during NEPA. This is Federal Highway Order 6640.1A. If you type in Federal Highway Order 6640.1A, you will get that link above. Whatever your preferred web browser is. It is not a new order. It is from 2010. I don't recall if it supplanted a different order or not. That's irrelevant, but it is something that's been out there for at least 11 years at this point. What it talks about is what you can actually do prior to getting NEPA approval. We have noticed, and Federal Highway has noticed as well, that it's more frequently that projects are running into NEPA and final design being started and completed prior to NEPA approval. And that's something that's specifically identified in this order that should not be done. So and we are aware that things can come up in the environmental process. And when they do, this is why we've talked about over the past several EPO webinars, workshops, whatever you want to call these interactive endeavors. That's why talking to the project sponsor, the designer, when these things come up, so that you can try and adjust the schedule. There's a lot more that can be done earlier in the project development process than if it's running late. And one of the aspects that can happen is that you could potentially very easily lose funding because you're trying to rush a NEPA decision while final design is already done, and there's not much that can happen unless there can be adjustments made to costs and things of that nature, and it's easier to do it ahead of time. Be aware that Federal Highway is aware that projects are running into this more frequently. It shouldn't be happening. Be sure to bring things up. It's not necessarily, it falls into design and not just environmental. But talking about when things come up and making people aware of what those updated timeframes are. So just something to be aware of. I know we don't have too much more time in terms of the presentation, but any questions or comments, I will stick around. We may stop the recording for those after it gets past the time frame. So if you have specific things that you want to talk about, we can. So we'll be sticking around for at least another 15 minutes beyond the recording if people have questions. Ross had, can property appraisals for right-of-way services occur prior to NEPA approval? I recommend that you go look at what the Federal Highway Order says. I don't know off the top of my head. The biggest one that I've been aware of is the final design aspects. So just go look at it. You might be able to identify what it is specifically. If you have further questions, you can always talk with the INDOT real estate group as to what aspects can and can't be completed prior to NEPA approval. Victoria asked, in general, what design stage should we aim for NEPA approval? Stage 1, stage 2. There are some individuals that think that they need to wait until they get more refined information to be able to make a NEPA decision, and so try to wait for stage 2. I'm of the opinion that you can get through and make general assessments based off of stage 1. as a professional, you should generally be able to do that. So preferably it would be you would have stage 1 plans included in the NEPA document, but it can be up to stage 2. When you get into LPA projects, there's not really a stage 2, so just be aware of that. So that's it for our presentation portion. It lasted a little bit longer than I expected, but we will stick around for 15 minutes. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great afternoon and a great weekend.